Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My thanks to all of you for being here. My thanks to Xiaoyan, Brian, and everyone at the Council for the invitation to speak this evening. As someone who literally wrote the book on the history of the World Affairs Councils, it's always nice to speak to one, and so I'm glad to be with you tonight. Excuse me. Every Citizen a Statesman, the book that I wrote, is not the kind of book that you might typically hear about at a World Affairs Council event. I'm not going to talk to you tonight about something that's happening elsewhere in the world and what the United States should do about it. I'm not going to talk to you today about whether we should go further to arm Ukraine or what our role should be in the Middle East. Instead of asking you or telling you what our national interest might be, I'm going to invite you to ponder, to think about a prior question, arguably a fundamental one. I'm going to ask you to consider who gets to decide what the national interest is. This is not a question that we often ask ourselves anymore, though our predecessors at events exactly like this one used to talk all the time until they were blue in the face about the relationship between our democracy on the one hand and our foreign policy on the other. Around the time that many of the World Affairs Councils were founded in 1949, President Harry Truman told the American public that there was, I quote, no more urgent task before us at this time than the building of an informed public opinion on the problems of foreign policy. None. Building that informed public opinion among the general public, and therefore solving the dilemma of what it means to conduct a democratic foreign policy, was the mission that gave the World Affairs Council movement life. And it's that history that I want to talk about a little bit tonight. The World Affairs Council movement traced its origins back to the end of World War I, to the Wilsonian conviction that the world could talk its way out of war and into peace through the League of Nations. In my book, I explore why many of the participants in the movement felt by the 1960s, 40, 50 years later, that they had not achieved what they could have done, and questioned whether the United States was really a democracy at all. The ideals that fired the movement live on, as do many of its institutions, and each time we meet at an event like this, we renew the firing ideals of a century ago. Doing that today is harder than it was in 1949 or in the decades before and just after that, at a time when so much about US foreign policy and how it was going to be conducted were not yet set in stone. Today, our democracy is quite a different one, polarized, subject to misinformation, unable to solve collective problems as it once was. Today, foreign policy, or more to the point, national security policy, is run by a comparatively small group of people who operate with little to no reference to the bulk of the citizenry. You can call this the foreign policy elite, the foreign policy establishment, the blob, as Ben Rhodes called it. You can debate how open it is to debate, how diverse it is, and so on and so forth. Nobody really denies that it exists. But I would suggest this evening that this is a fairly new concept. The idea that there is and should be a foreign policy elite or establishment, whatever you want to call it, in the United States came about during the Vietnam War, as even the Americans most interested in foreign policy, from students, protesters to World Affairs Council members, came to feel that they had little influence over the making of policy itself. The idea that there was a foreign policy establishment was a joke at the start of the 1960s, but it was a matter of common sense by the end of that decade. Historians, as we often like to do, then went hunting for the origins of this so-called establishment, decided that elitism was in fact a defining trait of US foreign policy and always had been, and left it there. But this, as Every Citizen and Statesman tries to show, was not the case. My book explores the kinds of alternatives that Americans in the 20th century imagined for the management of their foreign policy and their rise and fall. Most of the people who historians think were part of the foreign policy elite in the 20th century, especially in the 1930s, 1940s, men like Secretary of State on War Henry Stimson and others, would have been absolutely horrified at the way that foreign policy is made today. They would have thought it a betrayal of democracy. Most of them, indeed, took steps to ensure that the situation we have today never came to pass. This is the story that every citizen and statesman tells, how the foreign policy community sought to educate and even empower the American people through institutions like this one. They trusted that if Americans had the facts about their foreign policy, or at least its broad strokes, they could understand the world and guide policymakers through it. This, as far as I'm aware, is not a story that any historian has told before, which is a surprise because it involved the entirety of the foreign policy community up until about the 1960s, from presidents in the White House to secretaries of state, the heads of the Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford foundations, all the way down to thousands of politically active women and men who volunteered at council and other events across the country. They did not all, by any means, agree on what a democratic foreign policy should look like, or what the term meant. Their ideas were usually racist. For one thing, this was a movement almost entirely dedicated to white Americans. But they did agree that the United States needed a uniquely democratic, participatory foreign policy if it was to be true to itself and a positive force in the world. Much of this effort was channeled through the Foreign Policy Association, which isn't a huge organization now, but from its founding in 1918 to roughly the early 1960s was a hugely important nonprofit with tens of thousands of members. If you were interested in foreign policy in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, it was to the association that you turned to attend speeches, get information about foreign affairs that you couldn't get elsewhere, listen to foreign news, and so on. Every Citizen and Statesman is largely the story of the association. And because it was such an important part of American life, and it changed so starkly over time, you can tell the story of a democratic foreign policy through its activities, like how it quietly pushed America firsters out of the realm of legitimate debate in 1941, struggled to deal with the creation of the national security state at the start of the Cold War, and so on. The association was mostly responsible for promoting the World Affairs Council model at a nationwide scale, which it did in the early days of the Cold War. There was no one template for a World Affairs Council, though many of them emerged from an association branch, which would put on lunches at fancy hotels at which two or more speakers would debate a pressing issue in world affairs. But almost all of the World Affairs Councils trace their inspiration back to the example of one council, the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, which came of age after 1935. Now, the Cleveland Council was an astonishingly ambitious group, and it was primarily the brainchild of two men. The first was Newton Deal Baker, who was one of the most prominent politicians in the United States from about the early 1910s to the 1930s. He'd been Secretary of War during World War I, and he was widely viewed as a potential candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency until his death in 1937. He was America's most persistent champion of the League of Nations, and he also genuinely believed that talk mattered, and indeed that it could preserve the peace of the world, that meetings like this one had a role to play in securing world peace. In 1931, he said that the nature of democracy necessitates an educated electorate to provide for its own safety. Through the Cleveland Council, he hoped to create a situation in which, and I quote, every man, woman, and child could learn the economic, racial, social, and political outlines of the world, and therefore create that ideal of democracy and informed public opinion. The other inspiration behind the Cleveland Council was a completely different man, Brooks Ameni. He was much younger and a Republican. He was the first person ever to earn a doctorate in international relations from Yale, and he very cleverly married a Rockefeller heiress, which is something I advise you all to do if at all possible. He was a geopolitical realist. Later realists, men like George Kennan and Hans Morgenthau, absolutely hated the idea of public influence over foreign policy. But Ameni firmly believed otherwise. He thought that the world could only prevent war if Americans, the voters in the most powerful state in the international system, understood the full reach of their power. He believed that learning about world affairs was a duty of citizenship. Now, I won't go through the whole history of the Cleveland Council now, but I want to mention its sheer ambition. This was what a World Affairs Council was supposed to be at its peak. Because Baker, who, as I say, died in 1937, was not being disingenuous when he said that he wanted to reach every person in Cleveland. The picture on the front of the book, if you mind chopping these, and the bottom half here, you probably can't see it, is a meeting at I think it's called the Public Hall in Cleveland, of 10,000 people going to a World Affairs Council event to hear Arthur Vandenberg, the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That was a meeting sponsored by Time Inc. Henry Luce was there. Clevelanders went to hear a 3 or 4 day festival that was addressed by basically every world leader of note. And by 1951, the Cleveland Council was sponsoring or running, I have to take a deep breath at this point, open neighborhood discussion forums, library, church, hospital, and parent-teacher series, a speakers bureau, training programs for potential speakers, training programs for program chairs of Rotary, ELK, and other voluntary associations. It was putting on its own events, hiring its own speakers, running seminars, running closed discussion groups, and much, much more. In 1951, it held 1,200 events in a single year, which is a lot. Now, the Cleveland model was still very, very, very limited. It reached primarily a highly educated, white, pretty rich audience, and it was entirely dependent on a level of private funding, why I mentioned the Rockefeller heiress, that was unusual and kept secret. The model was already a touch outdated. It dated to a time when cities were crucibles of progressive reform, and not really for a time when suburbanization was in full flow. But when Khomeini became president of the Foreign Policy Association, he sought to spread the model across the country with the help of the Ford Foundation. This was not an easy task. For one thing, academic theories of democracy were changing, and the degrees of ignorance and apathy that were supposedly found in opinion polls, a fairly new invention at the time, suggested, some people at least, that the American people might not be educable at all. They couldn't be taught. For another thing, the Cold War was in full swing by that point, and as the Red Scare swept through the association and other groups, anti-communism made active discussion of foreign policy physically dangerous in some parts of the country. World Affairs Council meetings were broken up by John Birch Society members and so on. Although Khomeini became president of the association in 1947, it took until about 1952 for the council movement to really get going. And the Cleveland model didn't turn out to work well in a lot of places, mostly because Khomeini wasn't there to pay for it. It had to be adapted for local contexts. In places like San Francisco, Los Angeles, there was a focus, the leaders decided to focus entirely on an intellectual, political, social elite for entirely different reasons. In Dayton, Ohio, a wonderful council, they used television to promote the idea that world affairs are your affairs. This was the great slogan of the movement. And it reached a huge audience who had heard of the phrase world affairs are your affairs, but couldn't really tell you much else. What was constant across all of these efforts, though, was a lack of money and the quite limited vision of who ought to be involved in discussions about foreign policy that followed on from the constant need to raise funds. Great Decisions, which I imagine some of you are familiar with, originated as the association's attempt to engage with a much broader public than councils had been able to. It started in 1955 in Portland, Oregon, and it was a really simple program that asked participants to deal with the most basic issues in foreign policy, but it didn't stay that way. The other thing that was constant after World War II was the growing distance that the council movement and indeed the association had from the State Department, from policymakers, until it was too late. Around the end of World War II, as the State Department was preparing the public for the responsibilities that the United States was going to take up in the post-war world, it promised the era of what Dean Acheson, the Undersecretary of State, called the cooperative method of making foreign policy, government officials and the public working hand in hand. But the conflict with the Soviet Union pushed the state to embrace what it accepted at the time were propaganda techniques. Defense policy came to dominate diplomatic policy, and American thinkers had always known that war, or the war-like conditions of the Cold War, wasn't really conducive to participatory democracy. Even the Americans most interested in foreign policy came to feel like they lacked influence and purpose. By the middle of the 1960s, almost all of the 36 or so World Affairs Councils that were then in existence were in total crisis. In the fall of 1967, the winter of 1968, several were the targets of anti-war protests and accused of being just another part of the foreign policy establishment that they had been founded to prevent. Association officials accepted that anti-war protests were increasingly legitimate because people felt they had no real access to power. Speaking of the movement as a whole, the director of the Cleveland Council itself said in 1961 that we do not pretend that we are successful, we know that we are not. Now, the councils are still with us, and there are more of them today than ever, 90 or so across the country. Having published this book, I've been honored to meet many of the people who are still invested in demonstrating that the American people do have an interest in foreign policy. Many of the councils are thriving, whether through student programs, citizen diplomacy initiatives, cooperation with the State Department, and other things. But I think that the foundational basic requirement, basic question, of what it actually means to conduct foreign policy in a democracy has disappeared from our national agenda. Secretary of State Tony Blinken has often spoken as if it's optional for Congress and the general public to support his foreign policy. In his first speech in office, it was titled, "A Foreign Policy for the American People." He didn't give any sense that it should or even could come from them or be written by them. There are no easy answers here. Asking what it means to conduct foreign policy in a democracy means thinking deeply about who should participate in a truly democratic foreign policy and how. It means thinking about what it's reasonable to expect from a citizen and what the role of experts should be. It means thinking about how policymaking processes should be designed to allow for authentic public participation. It means thinking about how we respond to those who do not share the established view. But these are crucially important subjects, especially at a time when our world is again changing and when our politics are so divided. Brooks Ameni, the originator of the World Affairs Council ideal, if there ever was one, used to say that it was the essence of a democracy that the people decide on foreign policy, and the peril of a democracy that they decide in ignorance. Whether those words are true today, I don't really know. I'm a historian, I'm not a political philosopher, certainly not a politician. But I think that the sentiment behind them, the idea that we all have a responsibility to do our best by democracy, applies now as much as ever. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. I really appreciate what you've done here with the book. Is this coming through? I think it is. Okay.
Let's keep it close.
A little closer. Okay. I really enjoyed reading it. Several things that struck me, and it's a very good book. I would highly recommend it. It gives you a good sense of the development of these organizations over the years. One thing that struck me was,
that was my fault.
It. That's you. Okay. Maybe I'll just kind of lean this direction. One thing that struck me was how much participation there was in the 20s and 30s, especially the 1930s. I mean, this is an era that we usually think of as being isolationist. And some of the numbers of the meetings, you know, people attending the meetings that you bring up, was just astounding to me. I mean, this is a great topic, and this is not a bad audience, but it isn't, you know, 1,000 people or anything like that. So it seems like that was a very, very different era, which kind of brings up the question of what influences people to think about foreign policy. I mean, I've studied this stuff for years. I've taught it. I've taught it, and maybe I should could I try your mic?
Yeah, let's just use one. There we go.
Okay. Yeah.
Use that one. I'll turn this on.
Okay, is this one a little better, folks? Okay.
There we go.
And as a matter of fact, I'm going to stand up. Sitting is, yeah. So it seems that something in, just in terms of world affairs, has an impact Just what I've been observing, over my adult life has been first a fascination with the Cold War that I grew up with, and I was trained as a Soviet specialist years ago. And interest was high then, and then when the Soviet Union dissolved, interest disappeared. And I think a lot of the world affairs councils, committees on foreign relations, Foreign Policy Association had a really rough time. And then they get another bump with 9/11. But that's now been more than 2 decades ago, and that seems to have dropped off. So I was wondering if maybe you could talk to us a little bit about how you see events, or if you will, the international or the domestic political context impacting this public interest in foreign policy.
I feel like I should stand up now as well, but I'll sit. It's fascinating, Chuck. Thank you for that. This was a really great question. First of all, in the 20s and 30s, one of the things that shocked me in the research, there's still this popular misconception of the 20s and 30s as a quote-unquote isolationist time. Well, if you look at the organizations that were then thriving, they were very, very liberal internationalist groups that had, as you said, attendances at meetings of thousands of people at once. Where were these organizations strongest? The Midwest, where we think about, isolationism being at its strongest. These are really complex things to try and work out. When does interest go up and when does it go down? I think you put your finger on it. Major events, crises tend to drive interest, and then it's the question of how do you harness them. One of the interesting things in the course of the book that I found was that the kinds of people who ran World Affairs Councils up to the 40s and 50s hated, paradoxically, these moments of great interest, because they were precisely the moments at which emotions got out of hand, people stopped thinking rationally about foreign policy, and so on and so forth. The strangest part of the book, I think, for me, is when Brooks Ameni, founder of the Cleveland Council on Foreign Relations in 1940, testifies against the Lend-Lease Act, against it in Congress on the same day as Charles Lindbergh, the great America Firster, and he says, we shouldn't get involved in World War II because the people are too ignorant. We have to teach them, and I haven't had time to do it yet. And this is at the moment of, if there is ever a great debate on American foreign policy in the 20th century, it's then. That's the moment of maximum interest, 1939, 1940. So these things work in very, very strange ways, is what I found. At the same time, a lot of the people who were involved in the founding of World Affairs Councils for the same reasons didn't like moments in which the public was felt to express its will in a kind of untutored way. There was a thing called I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, a proposal that circulated in the 1930s called the Ludlow Amendment, which proposed that an amendment to the Constitution that said before Congress could declare war, there had to be a national referendum on it. Yes or no. And everybody involved in the movement hated the idea because, again, they had a fundamental distrust. These were the people who were most interested in public engagement, but they fundamentally distrusted kind of untutored public engagement. And those things were very, very difficult for me to get my head around in the writing of this.
Well, moments of crisis like that are also times when I think expertise becomes more important. If you have a Cuban Missile Crisis or an impending war, then the experts tend to take over. So I think that's an issue. Something else I thought was fascinating in looking at your discussion of the formation of the Foreign Policy Association early in the 20s and 30s, that it was heavily dominated by women. And while the Council on Foreign Relations in New York was exclusively male, and unlike the association, the council focused on top experts, on people who were movers and shakers, people who had a lot of money. And in a way, I think that's still the case with the Council on Foreign Relations. Having dealt with them, I know it's very much an elitist institution. But I thought that was just fascinating. So if you could talk a little bit more about that, I think the audience would appreciate it.
Yeah, I didn't talk about that much in my talk, but it was, I think, the most revealing thing I found in the course of researching this book. It was astonishing to me. When you think about the creation of foreign policy institutions after World War I, you think about the founding of the Council on Foreign Relations, especially a bunch of other kind of semi-think tanks. And for decades, historians have said, well, they were just entirely male, which they were. But because historians had kind of distrusted the public engagement side of things and had never written a history of the association, they'd missed the fact that if any demographic group dominated foreign policy organizing in the 20s and 30s, it was wealthy white women. The Foreign Policy Association directly comes out, I mean, explicitly and directly comes out of the suffrage campaign. The leading suffragists in the nation, Jane Addams, Carrie Chapman Catt, the women who had served, I'm going to butcher the acronym now, but on the National Association for Women's Suffrage, whatever, that one, the big one. The women who had served on its executive committee, who were primarily responsible for publishing campaign literature, for organizing meetings, all of them moved wholesale to the Foreign Policy Association because the women's movement changed after the passage of the suffrage amendment into a kind of pacifist, or at least the white portion of the suffrage movement, turned into a kind of pacifist crusade. And this was enormously interesting to me, just hugely. If you went to a Foreign Policy Association branch meeting in the 20s or 30s, you were overwhelmingly likely to be a white, usually Republican, wealthy, pretty educated woman, and you were likely to be sat next to one as well. But it was a world that those women struggled to escape. Service as the kind of chairperson of a Foreign Policy Association branch was often the capstone in a white woman's voluntary career. It was something that they did, when in their 50s or 60s. It was, the kind of apex of their service to their community. For the men who ran Foreign Policy Association branches, it was the start of their career. And so they would often be chairman in their 30s. They would use this as a platform for local and national politics. Nobody did it more effectively than Christian Herter, who was the president of the Boston Foreign Policy Association branch, effectively chair of his local World Affairs Council in the 20s, and ended up being Secretary of State in the 1950s. It was a fairly decent progression. This has had an impact because the public engagement side of things was seen as a realm in which women were very prominent and very effective. Men in the State Department increasingly decided that it was one that could easily be rejected for sexist reasons, which had an impact. The flip side of that is that these institutions are still, as the leadership of this council shows, an area in which women have still thrive, and at a time when increasingly there are calls for greater diversity within the foreign policy community. I think that's a valuable thing to note.
Well, you also alluded to the sort of the racial and class dimensions of this too. Minorities often were maybe deliberately excluded then. I think now still underrepresented in many foreign affairs organizations. And your average working class Joe too. You tend not to see too many of them. I would imagine if we took a poll here of the audience, that's what we would find. Not a lot of GE workers from the South End. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's really important to think about these things. The racial side of things, yes, a lot of these institutions were explicitly racist. They were also more implicitly racist, and this is where the race side connects to the class side. And I talked about it a little bit. What can we expect of a citizen? These institutions, as they still do now, to a certain extent, conceive of engagement. Let's take the 20s and 30s. If you were to engage with the Foreign Policy Association, in the way that was deemed legitimate, what did you have to do? Well, all of the meetings took place at the finest hotel in the city. So you had to be able to afford to pay for lunch. You had to have the right clothes to go there and not look like an idiot. You had to have time to go and do it and read up about it and so on. All of these things were predicated on the idea that you felt fairly wealthy and educated and were able to do this kind of stuff. Average Joes, as you say, in general, tended to find this more of a challenge. Later on, in the 40s and 50s, World Affairs Councils really did make more of an effort to get deeper and deeper into the community. But that rose another problem, which generated another problem, which we still really suffer from today, and that's about the way in which you talk about foreign policy. The World Affairs Councils are predicated on the idea that foreign policy is kind of a body of knowledge that everybody can come to accept, but it stands by itself. Brooks and Maney, when he was trying to push the Foreign Affairs Council in Cleveland deeper into the city, couldn't understand why labor union leaders in the city didn't want to engage with the council. And he says in one of his letters, I can't understand why they always want to take a working class point of view on everything. Why can't they just talk about foreign policy as foreign policy? Well, the reason is because nobody engages with foreign policy as foreign policy, and so the language with which foreign policy experts have always talked about foreign policy, certainly since World War II, does tend to seal off that body of knowledge from access. A last point on this: there was an astonishing survey that was done by one of the Washington think tanks, the Center for American Progress, in 2019, in which they ran a bunch of focus groups in Atlanta and other cities, and they invited people who said that they kept up to date on foreign policy news. They considered themselves well-read, well-informed, and they brought them into these focus groups, and they talked to the people who came in the language of a Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State. They asked them, what does liberal international order mean? And nobody in the focus group had any idea. What does so-and-so mean? Nobody knew. There's a persistent language problem. We talk about foreign policy in a certain way. Hundreds of millions of Americans do not. Even the internationalist isolationist thing that we were talking about earlier, there's a fantastic survey that I dug up in the archives of the State Department from 1949, in which opinion pollsters go out into various communities. I think it was in Albany, New York, and they ask people, are you an internationalist or are you an isolationist? And they can answer that question. And then you ask, so why? What are your policy views that line up with that description? And nobody can tell you. Because in their view, nobody knows enough to kind of be able to categorize themselves properly. And so there's a fascinating kind of play out of how we understand, how experts understand the world, how ordinary people, non-experts understand the world, and how we talk to one another, because it's really difficult.
Yeah, I think I'll ask one more question, then throw it open for questions from the audience. Just to follow up on that, and I know you're a historian, you may not want to deal with some things in the present, but I'll toss something out. On that class dimension that we talked about, a big, I think, source of support for Donald Trump and the MAGA movement is, it's got several international aspects. One is isolationism. One is a very critical opinion on international trade as costing us jobs and hurting the United States. And most economists will say 85% of jobs losses are caused by technology and innovation and not by trade. So certainly populism that we see now in this country is a manifestation of direct democracy. So what does that, given what you've written about, what you've studied, how does that factor in? What insights can we gain here about foreign policy and the MAGA movement? Sorry about that, but I had to ask.
That's okay. There are limits to the participatory democracy that we should seek, mainly. It's interesting. I was thinking about that a little bit today. I'm going to cop out of answering it directly. This book, but I'll answer it indirectly, I suppose. This book really took shape, ironically enough, during the 2016 election. That was when I was kind of thinking about the intellectual framework for it and talking to my advisor at Columbia and so on. And I was reading books by Walter Lippmann, John Dewey, who were writing in the 1910s, 1920s. And it was like I was reading an analysis of contemporary politics. Everybody's misinformed, nobody understands truth, there's misinformation everywhere, propaganda's all over the place, we can't get anything done anymore, there's polarization, all of the people are idiots, there's populism all over the place, what are we going to do about it? And then they actually proposed steps that could be taken to try and educate the public and so on, which in both Lippmann and Dewey's case were partly supporting the Foreign Policy Association and World Affairs Council. Dewey was a founding member of the FPA. I'm a historian, not a political philosopher, I have no answers or projections into the future, but as I was reading them, I was thinking those kinds of proposals for what could be done were not really around. There was a kind of lack of energy in the response to that rise of populism, or a lack of kind of concrete response that I found fascinating and slightly dispiriting. Then, as Trump was in office for 4 years, to talk about the persistence of expertise, for all of his rhetoric, what did he really get done in the foreign policy realm? Not a huge amount that was irreversible, at least. And so, there are limits even to executive power in the face of elite governments.
Okay, at this point, we'd like to invite members of the audience to step up. Let's see, we're going to pass the microphone around. Is that the case? All right. David, I'll let you identify people, and then if you could give them the mic.
Pick people.
Okay.
She's going to get a workout.
Do you have any sense of maybe what is done in other countries in terms of people being involved in foreign affairs?
I need my exercise. I was on planes all morning. Remarkably little. I always get this question. In fact, my dissertation committee asked me it as well, and the answer is nothing, which is interesting. And then I went back to my sources after they pointed out this glaring omission in my book, and this movement was really a kind of strange manifestation of American exceptionalism. Right? Democracy is everywhere. Right? Foreign policy is everywhere. But the way the World Affairs Council movement and related organizations justified themselves was nowhere, and I'm paraphrasing them now, not giving my own views, nowhere in the world was democracy more perfect than the United States. This at a time when most black people couldn't vote, obviously. Nowhere in the world does the technology exist, except in the United States, to have a kind of participatory foreign policy that could be uniquely democratic, radio and so on and so forth. Nowhere else in the world is as rich as the United States and able to share, and able to organize things in the same way. Nowhere except the United States is associational culture like this so strong. If a democratic foreign policy can happen anywhere, surely it can happen in the United States. Sadly, it didn't work. But that was their reasoning, essentially. I'm not aware of successful experiments that have happened in other countries, at least at scale. I've always waited for somebody to tell me, but no, I'm not aware of anything at all. And certainly there wasn't anything on the American scale anywhere else at the time. You pick and I'll run.
Are there any populations in the U.S. in the last couple of decades that are more involved than previously?
Ooh. I don't know. And I don't have any kind of comparative, I don't know how we would measure that, aside from kind of attendance at things like this. I do think there has been, since 9/11, as you said, Chuck, I think there has been a kind of drawn out interest in foreign policy issues that has lasted, perhaps longer than might have been anticipated, mostly because it's been crisis after crisis after crisis. But as Xiaoyan and I were talking about before, there's a certain amount of fatigue at this point, I think. There's only so many crises that we can take at any one time before interest starts to wane a little bit, or focus becomes difficult, you know.
Thank you. Would something like peaceful that help both sides, the receiving nation and the giving nation, help to revitalize better foreign relations?
Potentially. One of the interesting things I found in writing the book was how the World Affairs Council movement changed over time. Right? It started out very much as a forum in which Americans could debate the pressing issues of their time: Nazism, the Soviet Union, etc., etc., etc. When the Cold War gets going, suddenly there is less room for people to debate first principles, right? The United States is already in the world. The United States is already a member of the United Nations. The United States is, unavoidably in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. You can't really debate. It's harder for people to debate kind of first principle strategy like that. What happens to the World Affairs Councils in the 1940s and 1950s is they get more and more caught up in exactly the kind of programs that you're talking about, because they are often, sometimes, strong institutions in communities. When American policymakers want to wage the war of hearts and minds, or build international bridges, it's often to World Affairs Councils that they have turned. And it's then that period in the 1950s when you get the People to People program starting up, State Department foreign visitor programs, all of these kinds of things to build international connections as a way of facing down communism, right? And so with very, very limited resources, the World Affairs Councils turn to those kinds of programs. But they're not really what the council movement was there for, right? It's a different thing to tell somebody, come and join a World Affairs Council. You can be pen pals with somebody in, I don't know where, Hungary, build connections and show the United States at its best by doing that. You can be involved in the Cold War personally. You can feel like you can participate in that Cold War by doing that kind of thing. That's a different thing to come and debate as a citizen whether the Cold War is a good thing or not. You see the difference? It's kind of accepting the current position of foreign policy rather than giving people room to challenge it, right? Or continue with it. And that's an important change, because when these institutions became closer to government policy, and those policies change without much public input, then they start to feel kind of left out in a way that the continued debate side of things didn't really make them feel.
That, I think, you just answered my question. Do you feel
2 for 1.
the World Affairs Council really has an impact? Let's say that the councils get sort of a position that they give to the national policymakers? Are you heard or not?
I can't speak for today. In the past, no. And that was a huge problem, right? Chuck and I were talking earlier, one of the problems I identify in the book is that all of the kind of intellectual and activist energy behind the institutions was about how you engage the public, right? What kind of meetings can we put on that are going to get people in the door and help people learn? Shockingly little attention was given to, now that people are educated, how do they influence policy? Almost no attention was given to that problem, largely because the people were never educated enough in World Affairs Council organizers' view to have the influence that they wanted them to have. But there was very little attention paid to that dynamic. There was very, very briefly, between 1945, and it's going to sound very small, between 1945 and 1947, the State Department built a bunch of institutions to enact what Atchison called the cooperative model of foreign policy. There were national conferences on foreign policy at which nonprofit leaders would come to the State Department and share their views with the Secretary of State. There were conferences at which State Department people would fly in, spend 4 days in senior people would spend 4 days in a community, hear public views, take them back to Washington, all of these kinds of things. They built their own opinion poll outfit in the State Department to keep, to get a sense of what the people were thinking. And for 2 years, things look promising. And then the Truman Doctrine happens, and suddenly there's a Cold War to fight, right? And the same institutions then get, their mission totally changes. Then it's about, their executive branch institutions, which start to be used to put pressure on Congress to pass budgets that serve the foreign policy strategy of the executive branch, right? And they never recover from that. We still have them. There's still, I don't know if there's still Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, or there's a title like that. That was originated in 1944. So some of the institutions are still there, but on none of the scale that it was imagined at the time.
One of the things that has happened in the last 30 years is the role of think tanks in Washington, the do position papers and all of these other things. It seems to me to fill some of that role that you're talking about.
Yes, absolutely. There's some fantastic academic work that's been done on this. If you go back to, first of all, the FPA that I've talked about so much this evening, I think really was the first think tank. We don't think of it like that anymore because who was at a think tank? It had a kind of research staff and stuff that would write bulletins and get information out. But it was a think tank for the public. It wasn't a think tank for policymakers, although they were all reading the same thing, because they didn't know anything about the world either before World War II. After World War II, a different kind of think tank starts to emerge, more defense-oriented. My colleague, Danny Bessner, has written a wonderful book whose title I'm blanking on, who shows that the founding of something like the Rand Corporation, when the corporation was founded, its founders explicitly wrote at the time, the late 1940s, early 1950s, justified the founding of the Rand Corporation on the grounds that the public knows nothing about foreign policy. We have the opinion polls to prove it. And therefore, we, the experts, are going to stand in for the public and advise the government. And that's the situation that you just described. Now we have an enormous world of think tanks in DC and elsewhere that effectively do the public's job for it. The breadth, the kind of diversity of views that are represented in those think tanks is not terribly wide and doesn't represent public views, I don't think. But yes, you're exactly right. That is the function that the think tanks serve. And were designed to serve.
Sorry.
No, it's me.
Last question.
I
wondered whether you think that information rises from the bottom to the top, or comes from the top to the bottom. And the reason I ask this because I remember in 1968, I was living in Berlin at the time, and I knew a lot of people in the American consulate and so forth. And that was a time when Nixon was elected. And I was in a gallery, and it was the director of the consulate, two high-level people there made this statement that said, we would like to figure out what Nixon is thinking. And I was almost scandalized by that remark.
So the question is whether information goes top to bottom or bottom to top. Both. My politics were formed in the kind of, I grew up in England as if that weren't obvious. And when I was just graduating from university, it was the time of kind of Occupy Wall Street and so on. And this phrase was always in the air, trickle down economics, right? The idea that theoretically wealth would spread from the top of the pyramid to the bottom. So I was flabbergasted to turn to documents from the 1940s and find these people talking about trickle-down diplomacy. This was the phrase they used, the idea that eventually, naturally, if we educate the people at the top of the pyramid, the right kinds of views will trickle down to everybody else. So that was the theory on which these institutions were created. Educate at the top, it'll eventually filter down. And there were all kinds of academic theories at the time that seemed to suggest that that was plausible, which then got junked in the era that you're talking about of protest, when the information flow seems to change, right? These things don't just travel in one direction. It's, especially today, it's everything everywhere all at once.
One more question.
As an educator, school system as well as university, I don't recall, I don't think we do very much in our history classes or any of those kind of classes around world affairs. We don't necessarily study the world the way that perhaps our young folks could understand that they might have a role in any of this kind of thing. So in your research, did you find any place, anything around how these concerns about world affairs relate to educating our students? Again, you said we're all ignorant of this whole thing, so less ignorant.
Yes, and remind me, I'll tell you a funny story at the end. Yes, absolutely. There was a huge amount of effort right from the get-go, right from the mid-20s, late 20s. First of all, to get college students to events, and then when things moved to the kind of World Affairs Council model, the Cleveland Council, within a couple of years of its founding, had kind of junior councils in all of the public schools around the city, and so that was something that was copied liberally. I was just at another council. I spoke to the Philadelphia Council a few weeks ago, and I had no idea that they had found, I think in the 70s, they founded their own high school in the city for the teaching, explicitly for the teaching of international affairs. There was always a kind of sense of failure around these things because it's like, if we can't educate all the adults, then we have to turn to the children. Because they're a captive audience in your classrooms, right? They're young, we can get them at a formative age and so on. But there was always kind of seen as slightly a concession of failure, that you couldn't teach adults in the same way, which was not what the movement was founded on at all. It was Dewey's idea of lifelong learning and the idea that if the world is changing at a speed that we can barely comprehend, then we have to teach adults all the way through their lives to keep up and be proper democratic citizens. If there are no more questions, to talk about kind of shared ignorance. I was joking earlier, I have a PhD in history, right, from a decent university. And I know almost nothing in US history. And I know almost nothing about US history. Almost nothing. I know an awful lot about these institutions and something about 20th century US foreign policy, right? I spent 5 years of my career at the Belfer Center at the Kennedy School, feeling like a complete duck out of water. I mean, I didn't know what half of the people were talking to. The first day I got to the Belfer Center, I was a fellow there in the International Security Program. The chair of the program, Steve Walt, had us all in a room. And kind of ironically, if anybody knows Steve Walt's writing, said, "Welcome to the Belfer Center, and welcome to the foreign policy elite," for those of you who weren't previously members. And I sat there, I thought, Jesus, help me. I'm a member of the foreign policy elite now. I know nothing about the world. I should really think about that.
I think in many ways, David kind of, yes, he was planned. We brought him in specifically to talk about Workers' Council, so that you can all understand why it's important that we still have this organization today. But in all honesty, I think today more than any time, we really need to think about workers and foreign policy at the grassroots level. And of course, both Chuck and Dr. Ziegler and David mentioned there's a lot of tensions in that, whether it's expertise or individual, just needing to learn. But I think one of the things we always try is that make sure that within the scope that we have, the ability that we have, is to be able to inform or provide the important information that all the residents within our area is able to access and be able to make that informed decision or opinion that they have. I think that we're probably not going to get to the 10,000 with our Cleveland colleagues anytime soon, or maybe ever, but that's okay. I think that's not the time that we live in. So I really appreciate this research, because it's not something that most people do. And I know many of you who are members who's been supporting us and who come to these programs regularly, that you have a genuine interest in what happens in the world, or that you're interested in just knowing how we fit into the bigger picture, right? Whether we have that much of an impact in terms of policy making, that's a different type of enterprise, if you will. And we do advocacy at the Workers' Council through our international exchange program that is represented by our Kosovo group today. We do that because we believe in the power of exchange and the power of really understanding everyone that's outside the US and all of the different cultures that we have here in the US. So it may look very different than the 20s and 30s, but I would argue we're much more diverse, and the education level of that diverse population is much higher than it was before. So there's no reason why we shouldn't be much more informed globally than we were before. And so that is something that I really take, and I really believe it. And I want to thank Dr. Ziegler for providing that kind of that historical perspective in some ways, right? I mean, it is the world, we were talking about earlier that Cold War was one area that, when it ended, everybody thought that was it. We're done. We don't need to worry about international conflict and everything. And then 9/11 happened. And then all of these other things that happened. So we live in an international, globalized world, whether we like it or not. And I think and I think you all agree that we really need to be much better informed about what's happening in the world, about other people, because I can guarantee, as well I do, they know a lot more about the US than maybe we know about the US. So that is not a good thing for us in this century that we're in. So with that, I just want to say thank you to David, thank you to Dr. Ziegler for this conversation, because it's not something about, any particular topic of a global issue, but it's a topic about why should we care about any of the issues that we talk about throughout the year, right? We talk about all of the, whether it's climate change or, regional security in other countries, but this is why, because we have an interest in why things, how things can happen, and there is a role for us to play, even if it's just to be informed and be able to tell everybody around us what that information is. So I do want to encourage you, if you're not already a member, to support us as a member. If not, come to all of our programs, find anything that really interests you. We explore all kinds of issues these days, right? We're in a conflict-prone era in many ways. We know more about the conflicts. I'm sure there's as many conflicts back in the 30s, 40s, and whatever, but we just didn't know about it, but we do now. And so, because we know it, we have the ability to bring that information to you. So I'm hoping that you'll, let us know what you're interested in, and come to the programs that we are offering about all the important things that we think is important. The Foreign Policy Association that David mentioned, the Great Decision Series that is out. We just started this discussion group this year. If you are interested, you can go on our website, worldkentucky.org, and look that up. We are doing all series. It's a discussion. So you do have to read. You do have to know about the article we're going to be talking about. But then it's a chance for you to really kind of vet and listen to everybody and hear about the different ideas that's out there. And then finally, I just want to say, a couple of upcoming programs. I do want to mention that Dr. Ziegler is also the director of the Graumar Award at the University of Louisville, the Graumar Award for
World Order. Mm-hmm.
And there is, every year, this is a really big award with money. We don't always say that, with money, and that is given to a scholar. The talk when they bring them in is free to everyone in the community. And when is that?
That is Thursday, 1 o'clock in the Chow Auditorium, Ekstrom Library, ground floor. It is free, and the winner this year is Dr. Nita Crawford from Oxford University for her book, The Pentagon, Climate Change and War.
That's
This Thursday.
This Thursday.
Yep.
Fun topic. It's all these doom topics, but that is one. It's free, so make sure to check it out. It is these are amazing scholars that they choose. So there's that program coming up. We also have a couple of things coming up before the whole Derby craziness. So I just want to bring that up. Next week, Tuesday, we have a panel of international leaders, also through our International Visitor Leadership Program, which is kind of the highest level of exchange out of the U.S. Department of State. And the World Affairs Council facilitates those exchanges locally for our region. And we have a group in town of high-level leaders from 10 different countries working on cybersecurity. And Tuesday, we will be hosting a panel with them to talk about all of the different perspectives that different countries have about threats of cybersecurity or cyber threats around the world, and the possible collaboration, issues about privacy, data, all of those things, and the cultural perceptions about those. So I invite you to check that out. Think about attending. It's around the same time as today. It's going to be held in our office downtown 5th Street. The next program after that is going to be our Great Decisions discussion on 23rd, also at the office in downtown. And that's the topic of that particular Great Discussions is going to be on climate technology. So again, you read the article, very short, and then come prepared to just have a lively conversation about it. And then the last thing I want to talk about is we have our next speaker program at the Filson is going to be May 9th. It's going to be with Talmadge Boston on his book about how the best did it. It's going to be focusing on the best presidents, the lessons from the presidents of the past who did extremely well in terms of leading the country during crisis in all times, and what can we learn from that? And obviously, the idea is what can we learn from that, and how can that inform us in thinking about our presidential election coming up in November? So please put that on your calendar. It's going to be May 9th. It's going to be here, and that conversation is going to be moderated by our former mayor, Jerry Abramson. So May 9th, and we will send out all that information. And with that, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry you can't join us.
Oh, just too much going
I
on
know.
right
I
now.
just wanted to say my family is from Cleveland.
Oh, yeah. Don't want to
And,
walk off.
and so both sides of the
Yeah,
family
yeah.
are from Cleveland. And then we moved to
That was really interesting. She said, oh, please, please, please. Hey, good to see you. Are you, we have the Mainz trip. We spoke to one of the board members on the German American Club. Tried to get him to get us. Yeah.